Hey, good afternoon, everybody. It's noon Pacific on a Monday, so that means it's content chat time. And today we are going to be talking about one of everybody's favorite topics, which is generative AI and content marketing. And to do that, we have Forrester's Lisa Gately here. Lisa, welcome to Content Chat, or welcome back, rather, but this is your first time doing the video chat with me.
It is. Thanks, Erika. I'm really glad to join you all.
So excited here. But before we dive into the topic, I always like to make sure that we get everyone on the same page. So I was hoping you could let people know how Forrester defines generative AI and how it's different from a lot of the other types of AI that we've been working with as marketers over the past few years, and just kind of do a little bit of level setting so that way it's clear what we'll be talking about today.
Yeah, and this is not too basic a question. I really see it, generative AI, we describe it as it's a set of technologies that we're going to leverage structured and unstructured data so that you can generate new content. It could be in the form of text, image, audio, or video. What that does is different because you may have some natural language prompts and be able to interact with this data to do that generation. Marketers have been using AI for ages. And so I say it's not too basic a question. Really, with all of this exploding interest in generative AI, marketers sometimes are asking questions about, were we using some things that were predictive, prescriptive? Was it helping us, with doing things of more like clustering, segmenting, predicting things? You think about a lot of stuff for content and content targeting, personalization, predictive scoring. You can go on and on with some of the uses we've had with social media management. Some of these areas where you get into, yes, AI has been embedded in a lot of the MarTech stack. But with generative AI, for that definition, think of this as you now can get at some of the data previously wasn't as available to average marketers, and to be able to use whether language prompts or with some vendors, you're even able to do some generative matching, like of imagery, some things like that.
I think that's really helpful to level set because, again, what's interesting to me even is many of us had been using marketing technologies that had AI components without even realizing it, because you just got used to, there'd be recommendations or insights that would automatically just turn up. And it's like there wasn't a person behind there pushing out those prompts to you. It was, stuff that was happening with AI behind the scenes. But it feels like because of the availability and accessibility of the Gen AI tools like OpenAI's ChatGPT, it really meant that people started talking about it and experimenting with it. Whereas, with the other kinds of marketing tools, you had to have, an enterprise budget and to have signed on and done the training, I think, really to necessarily understand how the AI was working.
That's so true. And it's a good observation because it brings up a lot more discussion now that people are, because of using, whether you name the tool, some forms of generative AI that we might even use just in our personal life, crossing into business, you now start to recognize some things. And it's prompting a whole lot of education or conversation where, to your point, you either had enterprise budget or you were a certain domain expert.
Yep, definitely. So where are you seeing that the biggest benefits are coming for marketers in incorporating generative AI into their content marketing strategies?
So it's early days, despite what everybody is saying. I see a lot of people starting with that area, if you call it improving time to market, productivity, and especially in content, you hear of people talking about it's more creative possibility. That's one side of it. And I say that because there are so many activities that help you be able to riff on and streamline some things to get those activities done in the content lifecycle.
Totally.
I also see some things where more marketers now are talking about not just doing things faster or more efficiently. They want to see some effectiveness. And what I mean by that is, clearly we've talked about personalization for years as marketers. They're now starting to talk about, how can I use this if I'm going to personalize and create more variants of things? I'm able to get to more variants, testing out the interactions for our audience and being able to see, does this make a difference for us? Marketing effectiveness or customer experience, whatever that marketer is defining. But you're starting to see people think about This is helping us speed this process. If you think of, in the past, maybe some limiting factors for campaigns or being able to, we call, really customize the experience.
Yep.
It's now within reach.
I think it's helped too that there are some of the visual like email marketing tools, like what NAC recently came out with, and a few others, where you don't have to be down into the bowels of your automation system and understanding how to program things. Instead, you can just say, hey, select some copy and say, I want this copy to vary based upon the customer segment. And, you can have as many customer segments as you can realistically create differentiated copy for, or create, different images. But with AI, you can actually test yourself and say, all right, I have this copy in place and I think it's good for this audience, but is there something I'm missing? Can you optimize a little bit more for that audience? And frequently the AI will give you some great suggestions for how to maybe change a word or something to look for in an image that you hadn't really thought about. And then all of a sudden you're able to do that kind of personalization at scale, where you can talk to all of your different audiences without having to create 50 separate emails that have to go through approvals and all of that, and take up so much time that it's not practical. So that to me has just been so interesting and fun to see, because we've only been talking about one-to-one marketing for 25 years, and now it looks like the technology's finally caught up.
It is. And it's funny, as you say that, thinking about how we will work differently, because for a lot of marketers, we've been getting by. We've managed to make some things work. And as you said, it's time to have some help. That your example, I love that part about you're getting some of these ideas. It's like having a thought partner there about what you could do. But for the marketer, to do the checks, to do some of the riffing on this example versus that example, and see whether it will work.
So cool. So in your day-to-day work, I know you're advising all sorts of content marketers. So I'd love to hear some of the use cases that folks are really seeing the AI making an impact. And I also am interested if there are like any significant differences between how B2B content marketers are using it versus B2C. Because, sometimes it feels like B2B marketers that we're a little bit behind because of the complexity of our of what we're doing. But this might be a case where we might actually be ahead because of that complexity driving needs. So I'd love to hear your take.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I work with B2B marketers of all different backgrounds. So when I talk to them about generative AI, it widely varies depending on their organization or their role. Really what I see overall is great interest in the content lifecycle. No surprise, no matter what their responsibilities. It could be from thinking about planning and using generative AI, not just for generating things, but I hear of people who are already, I'll call it more knowledge worker productivity. They're using it to summarize information, or if you're using it to do some research, it's a thought partner. Just like that example you gave, if you were trying to really think through for your audience, how do I make this more specific? How do I work on topic selection? How do I work through, am I filling some gaps? And particularly you're looking at maybe competitive sense of your content. Where can I stand out? That's a whole planning arena that's really interesting to a lot of marketers. Then there's the generation or the content creation. We see a big yes. I know of everybody thinking about, I just want some headline ideas, or help me with an outline, help me with the beginnings of a brief, help me with some drafts. And I think what a lot of marketers realize is, despite about a year or more ago, this is not something that's going to give you a whole asset. So hang out, just hang with this. It's going to take some learning. I hear a lot of marketers talking about, yes, it does take some skills as you get used to working in this way, but definitely you're able to produce, whether, again, text, images, audio, video. I see tremendous power for creative teams, by the way. And we know a lot of content teams, they're not distinguishing, but definitely in the realm of some imagery and what is possible for people who have had concepts in their mind and maybe they're not a designer. You're able to get to some things quickly. I also see this of the power of using, let's say, things to get the transcript for marketers who are working with, let's say, events, recordings, and you're trying to then repackage or reformat across format. I hear a lot of power, not only events, webinars, podcasts, really great examples of people being able to do the accompanying material for that quicker. So think of the things where you've put work into maybe a primary format. If you are crossing over and doing something else, let's say following up with, I need the social posts, I need a landing page, I need an email, maybe create a blog, create some related articles. There are other things that you can do. You're reusing a lot better. And another area is also that, again, back to customization, also the localization translation. So we know that marketers have used machine translation to some degree, but I see generative AI opening up some interest there too.
Totally. Because of course you're still going to want to have those regional marketing teams
Yeah.
review it, but it just really accelerates things. Because
Yes.
in one of my last in-house roles, was in charge of content for an entire global team, and
Yes.
sometimes they would be having to wait for weeks because our regular translators were busy, because we just didn't have a tool that was good enough for that first version. So it could take weeks before we could get something to them. And, inevitably that means that somebody would create their own version of something that was
That's
not
it.
branded
Yeah.
and not and not what we wanted to have go
Yeah.
out there. So, just being able to have things like translations or transcripts be
Yeah.
readily immediately available, and without you having to feel like you're underpaying people for their work.
Right.
Because I know in the past, certainly some of the platforms, you felt like, maybe you feel a little bit bad about the pricing and, how much per hour does this end up being for the human being doing the transcripts?
Yeah. A lot of those complexities, then you're right. I think of people, crossing over your responsibilities. If you're part of a global team or if you are someone responsible for getting things from a central or global team, I think a lot of marketers have been felt like, I have such wide coverage. Content is a large part of what I do. You are going to start to see some of these capabilities make it possible to do some things yourself too. That not
Yeah.
only the speed we talked about, I also look at it as for marketers who previously maybe they worked with an in-house team or an agency if, let's say, they needed a video or they needed a shorter clip that they were going to use in social. So it depends on the background, but I see a lot of more creativity, but the power to go do some of these things, especially in a lot of the reuse that marketers do if you are expanding the production. And on
Totally.
that note, you asked me a great point about B2B and B2C. So in general, I talk with B2B marketers the most. I've worked on a project recently with a colleague who focuses on B2C. And so interesting observation here is our viewpoint is that Forrester sees B2B buying, the big changes in buying behaviors. And that is in B2B, we know that buyers tend to buy in groups. It's much more likely you are dealing with lots of individuals who are doing some research, whether they're
Yep.
visiting your website, consuming, engaging with content, as opposed to just an individual. So in B2B, you're right. There's the complexity of how do your marketers and sellers work together? How we know that there's a lot of content fueling engagement. So from the time that you are working with somebody, very beginning stages, in terms of across marketing and sales, are you able to capture some of these signals? I see a great retooling of systems across marketing and sales. How do we start to learn about our audience? And then based on some recommendations or what we know, can we start customizing it so that you can deliver a more contextual experience? That's much more what we hear from B2B. From B2C, what you're hearing about is, yes, there's some interest. It might be more in the dynamic creative optimization. And I think of that for some of the big brands, they've been doing this to some degree. It's now going to get faster as we talk about it. I think of one, recent conversation about how do you really hook on some things at the speed of social media? Like we were talking before this call about Barbie or some things that are pop culture or things that
Yep.
happen. I think B2C, B2B, people will have a lot of interest on that note of customizing and personalizing or being able to respond when there's a really timely opportunity. You can start customizing and coming out with content that just really would not have been possible in the past if we were using our usual methods.
Well, that, of course, though, brings up sometimes that speed, though, may mean that we end up bypassing or overlooking some of the risks associated with generative AI, um, especially because of all of the unknowns around intellectual property and copyright. So I'd love to hear your thoughts around some of the risks that, even though we're jumping in and we're excited to be using it, what are some things that marketers need to be thinking about before we do that?
Yeah, you're right. There's so much optimism in a way, but there are really thorny problems that there's no set answer coming soon on some things. And I say this, picking up from your intellectual property. Just in the past month, I was trying to collect for a presentation some headlines of the past month. I think a lot of marketers feel like your head is spinning from the things that are constantly coming out. And that is, are we going to see some lawsuits or some rulings that come about how are these models trained on copyrighted data? I hear of marketers saying their legal team is very concerned. Are we inadvertently infringing on copyright? Or are we working on something that's really important for our business? It's really high investment content. We want to protect the copyright for that. So it's being very thoughtful about how you are using generative AI, having those conversations, not just with your employees, but your vendors, your freelancers, anybody who is involved in the process. It's also, building on that, everyone talks about hallucinations or trust. I think this is going to become the next area. It already is, of especially in an election year, a lot of deep fakes. How do you make sure that you are protecting your company, your brand? You really want to have a check on accuracy, where now we know the more that generative AI is used, you have to have some humans who are checking. More important for editorial and judgment-based skills, but you're also looking at this as, do we recognize any signs of bias? Do we recognize some things that are, it's very confidently said and it's plausibly written, but in the results, we were talking also about, imagery or some things that we realize some marketers tell me their company is not using imagery or video yet with some of the confidence, but I know technology companies are moving really fast there. The other side of it really quickly is how much, setting aside the big legal concerns, data, security, privacy, how are you protecting customer information? Also, as we step into this new way of working, there are some real risks in collaboration. I hear of a lot of marketers who this is like bring your own AI to work, the use of unapproved tools. In any of our usual steps of creating content, what you could see, and I've talked to some marketers about this, is are you starting to see some points along the way in the content cycle where someone has used AI and it's just pushing more work to another stage in the cycle because you start to recognize it and you have to go back and rework, and talk with people about what were we really trying to do here.
Yeah.
The collaboration issue. So it really, that we know is a major challenge just with content itself. So you might have different parts of the organization using different tools. How do you get a handle on the content you have, reusing it well? All of the things we were talking about in terms of, so there's unapproved tools, or maybe there's some inadvertent, duplication of content. That happens in our life as it is. But I also see this opening the door where it's not creating the efficiency that some marketers or companies think at first.
Yeah,
If
because
you leave,
frankly, it's not being integrated with any
yeah,
of the other tools. It's being used on a standalone basis. So it doesn't know what is in your content inventory. It hasn't read everything because you haven't, most marketers haven't taken the time to train their own generative AI. They're using someone else's model. So it doesn't know the whole, breadth of their offering.
that's it. And
So
I think, that is worth talking to everybody who has a role in content, again, about here are brand guidelines, brand voice. I shudder. We all do it. Everybody just doing their own prompting of what they think your brand voice is, to inadvertently good intentions, but there may be sharing some information in prompting and using these tools that really shouldn't be going outside the company.
totally.
Yeah.
And I love that you mentioned the brand voice because I feel like when used properly, AI can be a tool that can help people in all of their customer interactions to maintain the brand voice. But again, that means you have to have documented your brand voice.
Yes.
You have, and so many. I mean, I can maybe think of one or two clients that I've had over the years who had a documented brand voice for creating content before I came on board with them. But the rest of them, that's the first thing I always do, because how on earth can you expect other people to be creating content for your organization if you haven't thought about what is that differentiated voice? How do you sound that's different, or what elements about the way that you construct your content is different than everybody else? And if you don't have that in place, you're going to have really boring, generic content that sounds like everybody else's, which nobody is clamoring for more of that.
Yep. That you got it. That in a nutshell is where a lot of marketers may ask, what is this going to do, in disrupting our jobs? But I still see there's going to be a need for people who have that skill of, you understand your audience, you understand your company goals, but your messaging, your positioning, your brand voice. Do you have a handle on content analytics, or how do you manage some of the content? All of these collaboration challenges that happened in our lifetime before generative AI, it's still there. Generative AI isn't going to take over and make this easier. You've got to have some of that content, called content operations, or a lot of these skills and expertise still matter.
Totally.
Yeah.
And then I think, what we're seeing too is, people are experimenting or doing these AI projects, but they don't necessarily have, a very specific AI use policy or AI disclosure policy. So I'd love to hear more from you on your thoughts about, how can content marketing teams create guidelines or structure around the use of generative AI so as not to step in it and, to use it ethically and to really have more transparency with the people that they serve.
Yeah, that is a really important one, because I feel for a lot of teams where marketers, depending on your organization and how some things have been rolled out, whether there's a company-wide initiative, there are a lot of marketers left on their own. So in that case, you may have your company helping you. If not, I really lean back on, we were talking earlier about education. First of all, a lot of education communication across the marketing team, not just the content team proper, but everyone you're going to be working with for stakeholders. So you're raising a lot of awareness about what does this do for us. And then it's stepping into, like you said, do you have some idea about what business problem this is solving? I often talk with marketers, this is a basic step, but we're not using generative AI for the sake of using this technology. There's some direction about what you use it for.
Yep.
A lot of people jump into talking about use cases, and that's great. I think the second thing is, as a company, you're starting to really assess what capabilities you have, and where you might step into this first. It's important as a content team. Content is one of the, I'll say, most clients tell me they view it as a company as low-hanging fruit. We know the complexities there, but you are a great expert to step in and start working with others of your company of, wait a minute, there's a lot of activity in content. Let's start getting more specific about use cases, that you may not jump into all types of content, all activities of content, based on knowing some of your content maturity. And I say, just as you did, it's important to really look at your current maturity and think about, there are some areas that are well suited for your organization. Start there. Start framing projects with others and involving the experts. I really see a lot of organizations, whatever you select, let's say it's SEO or email or your blog, there are many different areas where you may choose to start working first. A lot of those marketers start stepping into, what could we do, and trying to outline, here's our hypothesis, here's a pilot project. You're then evaluating, to your point, usually reaching out, is there some kind of company policy? Is there any specified, accepted list of tools, or you're looking at your existing capabilities, what else you may consider? I talk to a lot of marketers that eventually, if they have not already done so, they're going to be talking with IT or security or others across the organization. We know that it's the other thing that's, I think, for marketers is really digesting. We see a lot of capabilities coming to market right now, including there's stuff that's already approved, it's in use in your organization. There's new capabilities there. But then also, do you consider some other purpose-built tools? Not to mention, like you said, if your company has, let's say, an agreement with OpenAI or Microsoft or Google, there are multiple areas where you could do this work. So as a content team, it's also identifying what type of work gets done where.
Totally makes sense. And I think it's hard too, because when you have this big list of here are all the ways we could use it, it can be hard to, I think, evaluate where you're going to get the biggest impact and where, you really should be using generative AI to improve your workflow. So I'd love your thoughts about how to make those evaluations and how to prioritize what to do first.
Yeah, I admire some marketers when I talk to people across the board. They usually have some initial ideas. In some organizations, they've had proposals from the marketing team, or especially a content team, or some of these areas where they know there's kind of a first round of use cases they're going to pursue. It really is trying to frame this about what this does for your business, and someone close to knowing the exact tasks or activities. How would you start to experiment in using this? So it is forming, in other words, some type of core team. You give it whatever name works for you. But usually there are some team members who are identifying these are the specific areas where we're going to test or pilot using generative AI, and identifying certain tasks. I tell people apply the same rigor as a project where you're going to be given some kind of a readout or sharing what you learn to marketing leadership. So if you are testing out your hypothesis, and I am just making up an example, I've talked to marketers where if they're experimenting for email or their blog, they're capturing some sense like it's an experiment of here were the inputs or prompts, here are the outputs, and here's actually an area where we're trying to rate or observe. Did this do what we thought? Is it doing this at an acceptable level? It may take some time for the marketers who are first using it, but be able to compare to, let's say, your baseline process. Is that cycle time, in producing the content? Is it also effectiveness of some marketers who are looking at how is my AI generated content, is it performing compared to our human generated content? Is this giving us anything? Some marketers, I'll just close by saying, they've realized I have more traction in this area than that area. And I'd say, good for you. Have the confidence to go focus in some areas and be ready. There's this mindset of you may try multiple things. Some areas work better than others for you. That's okay. So go after some of the things that I'd say use cases are very subjective. So just because you were hearing about some other organization, what they're doing, choose a few areas that are helping you get to some result and be ready to measure, be ready to talk to others in the team about what you found. I hear of some of the organizations moving forward, they have a great, what I'd say, continuity of people are sharing not only best practices, but they're trying to set up a prompt library, or they're trying to have some show and tell time of not only show here's what worked, but here's something I discovered that I don't want to do it this way again. Help others so they don't fall into this the same way.
That's so important. And I really agree that, different organizations, based on the maturity of their messaging, based on the maturity of their documentation, or they're really them having those kinds of templates or workflows that are well defined, all of that stuff is going to vastly change what's going to work well for you in generative AI and what's going to just take more time for you trying to teach one of the models how to do things your way. But on the flip side, it's like, I'm hoping that it'll spur more folks spending that time to actually invest in those foundational pieces that are always kind of on the to-do list for content marketing. Oh, well, we'll get around to updating our style guide or creating a style guide someday. It's like, well, if you want to use AI and have it be consistent with a bunch of different people using different tools, that day needs to be sooner than tomorrow.
Absolutely. But yeah, some of these tasks that we always manage to procrastinate, or something else comes on our plate, this is a time. I hope that this year a lot of marketers really address both style guides, for that matter, tagging and taxonomy, or if you are thinking about some of the templates, and also identifying for your broader team, here are examples of what good looks like. Inspire people maybe. And so some of those things that I know we feel like we'll eventually get to it. It's also kind of tedious, but it's important now because you're helping everybody get better results with this. So it does matter.
Exactly. So I don't know about you, but I'm kind of dreading what the next version of the MarTech landscape infographic is going to look like, because of the explosion of Gen AI applications that are designed just for marketing. So in order to not have to think about that, do you have some recommendations for some of the tools that are maybe more purpose created for content marketing, or for some of our favorite B2B content marketing use cases that you would recommend?
Yeah, so that is really interesting. You talk about landscapes where it's just been an explosion, and it's really hard on some of the existing charts out in the marketplace to discern what's realistic for a lot of marketers. So I
Yeah.
just give the biggest caveat that there's no set list for all organizations. I think we all have different starting places and paces for bringing new technology into our team. So what I would say is, just with that caveat, is go out and look through your existing MarTech stack. There might be some existing capabilities there. Um, Funny thing in my research, I do want to be able to address it because it's one of the top questions I get is, help me understand the landscape. And I would break it up as people talk about it into, what kinds of things are you trying to do? Inevitably, you come back around to whether it's a certain marketing area, or I think of it even as breakout by text, image, audio, and video. So some of those tools are starting to have multimodal capabilities, not unlike ChatGPT, So some areas, like I know a lot of marketers are very familiar with Jasper or Writer as an example. They're starting to do different things. So even if you're starting to look at things by text or imagery or audio, we're seeing and hearing about a lot of vendors. People have, just thinking of the past couple of weeks, what's been in the news with 11 Labs or HeyGen or some of those tools. There are many, let's say, startups or exciting tools that give us some capabilities. I hesitate to give a lot of names because some marketers would say, I don't have a chance of bringing it into my organization. There are some sources, whether Forrester or others, who can help you in kind of a quick list if you are starting to look at the typical categories of what your broader marketing team has in place. Yep, a lot of things are coming into generative AI to help you with, and you could almost fill in the blank. So look at what your company has, ask those vendors what's coming. Then you might also look at some of those other, let's say, broader categories as you start to look at, yes, there are a lot of exciting things, but let's say you were already using Adobe, or you could fill in the blank with other big names.
Mm-hmm.
There are some really great things that maybe it is a matter of your team exploring and extending what you do with them. You might supplement that. Again, depends on your organization. If you have approval for a few pilot projects, I know a lot of organizations tell me, we're really cautious right now of having too much dependence on one vendor. And even with the drama we saw in late November with OpenAI, I think a lot of people felt like, don't put all of your hopes on one vendor. Start to look at a few areas, even if you're thinking, my company is a Microsoft shop or Google shop, and we're going to use whatever they are bringing us. For marketers, you're not going to find one tool that does absolutely everything across the content lifecycle. I think there's huge, what I'd say, when you look across a lot of content experts, there's a huge array of things. So don't get overwhelmed thinking you have to experiment with everything. You might place a couple of strong bets, and that's looking at what you already have access to, and maybe a few other tools that we've mentioned.
And you can, frequently you just look at what your objectives are for the year. And if one of your objectives is really to get more ROI out of your events, for example, well, then that means you need to do more content repurposing. So then maybe you're going to be looking at a tool like a Descript. So that way you can take those videos, get a really fast transcript, and be able to create a ton of little social media snippets, and be able to reuse, repurpose, upcycle a million different things.
Yep.
So I think it's so important for people to always go back and think about that bigger picture and where things lay, because otherwise people are like, well, we feel like we need to be doing something with generative AI. So, I went and I got the paid version of ChatGPT. And it's like, well, okay, that's nice.
Yeah. I love your point about being really specific with your objectives. I meet a lot of marketers where in their company, they're going to have some tough times getting some things approved. And so some of it is being really specific and narrow about the use case on purpose. That like you said, am I repurposing event content? Or some people have told me I am using, for example, the tool lately.ai. I want to use my existing content to get social posts. If they're trying to clear a lot of security requirements or compliance requirements for their company, that narrows things to a subset of tools. And so don't be put off if you are thinking about a specific use case. It is a way to step into it.
Totally. So before we open up the floor to questions, I'd love to hear, your thoughts on some of the common pitfalls that marketers should be aware of when it comes to jumping into using generative AI, and maybe some things they can think about or put in place before they do in order to avoid them.
That's a great one, because I know that in some ways we think of this as magic, and a lot of us in content know your starting place will affect your success. So some of this is, if you have a handle on the content you have, what are the examples of best content to repurpose or think about for training? You as a content person are a really good spot to be able to identify a lot of that. If you suspect, we think that we have reason to review our taxonomy and make some changes with tagging, also think about that. I've talked with some really savvy clients who are thinking about, how are we getting ready if we want to measure AI generated versus human generated content? You're thinking about that from the start, not just waiting until people are producing drafts of different things and stuff starts flying around. So that's a good, awareness. Also, again, the messaging, positioning, your templates and brand voice. If you haven't touched any of that material in a while, even sharpening on personas. If you really, there are a lot of people who will talk about using AI to help them with prompting and understanding more about the audience.
Yeah.
You still need to have some understanding in your organization. Who are you prioritizing? Do you have some, let's say, persona interviews, customer interviews? There's got to be things from your organization experience you could put to work for you. Then as you start stepping into generative AI, I think of some pitfalls, meaning this is not overnight instant success. In that, you're trying to bring people on board as a team. So think about your workflows. Like you were saying, a lot of this is prepare people. It's also, I talked to some organizations where there's a content team that carrying your regular load, which we know a lot of teams are overworked, and you're already doing, let's say, the next big thing for your company's launch or event, and you're doing these pilot projects. Be ready to communicate and get some help. You may have some experts who can work with you on this, but it's keeping some rigor around it, because you're going to be doing some kind of sharing or readout eventually to tell people, this is why we are recommending, and we've got this approved use case. You want to back up from your experiments, let's say your pilot projects.
Yep.
We learned that we're getting a good result with this, not that. All of that, and being able to prepare your recommendations will help you. I also talk about with some clients, it is preparing that eventually you might also be talking with team members about, how do you have, let's say, not only training on a particular tool or your new process, but how do you come back and look at, you're going to be evolving little by little. People are going to have findings along the way. So is there some kind of, whether it's you have a regular team meeting, or call it a content council, or somebody who gets together periodically to talk about, how is it helping you? You want to be able to notice some things if the outputs are still working the way that you think they will, or if you've got some early observations to help troubleshoot where some teams need help. It's
That's
also
so,
oh yeah, go ahead.
because I'm just thinking, with the pace at which they're releasing new models or new functionality, that alone means you've got to be evaluating how this stuff is working pretty regularly, and adapting, your approach. Because if you're not, I just, you're going to get really blindsided when all of a sudden there's a new version that does things very differently. If you're not paying attention and communicating, then people
Yeah.
are going to be upset that they've, I thought this was the new process. It's like, well, the new process isn't going to be a set it and forget it for years. The new process is going to be how we're approaching it today, and maybe next week it'll evolve. You can't, you can't count on it to stay the same forever.
Absolutely. And I think of it as, people are maybe underestimating the change management and the communication that's going to be involved. It makes me think of that Jenny Magic and Melissa Brecker's
Yep.
book about change fatigue. I think that's going to be on a lot of people's minds of how do we get people, we've worked a certain way. You're not going to necessarily see this magic that people think of. It did everything I expected. I've been in some calls with clients where they realize there is a learning period as you step into it too. So it's also culturally, it's allowing people to say, this didn't work the way I thought, or we think we've had a setback. It's accepting that because you're going to learn, you're going to move forward. But we're in this period of everybody we all know we're really overloaded with the work to be done. We have such high expectations too, that it's giving yourself, there's room to learn, room while you're changing.
And, if nothing else, just try to think of the AI as your intern. And you have to, put in that time with the AI the way that you would with a human. You can't have the expectation that immediately out of the box that you're going to be getting amazing results.
That's a great parallel. Yeah, because I think marketers we're used to, let's say you start working with a new freelancer or agency, you're used to some onboarding time. And so AI is going to be like that. That's a good analogy of your intern or your new agency.
And maybe that also is a way to help people feel more generous towards the AI as far as giving it feedback versus feeling frustrated that it doesn't immediately understand what they're trying to do. Because you wouldn't, hopefully you wouldn't bite somebody's head off immediately for them not understanding you, but people can get really frustrated with technology pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Because you're expecting it to be the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah. I was talking with one marketer. It really impressed me because he said, you got to figure out what you can do before you sign up for the higher stakes work with this. So give your team room. I've heard of another leader who had the team, went around the whole team, and people agreed they were going to look at certain tasks within the next week of how they would experiment with the task and then come back. And it really, I knew of some people who felt uncomfortable and said, I'm not sure if I was doing this right. And you want to tell everyone we've all had this experience. This is what we're all stepping into, is realizing I'm in early stages with it. I'm going to learn.
That's so important. I'm going to open up the floor to Q&A. If folks are listening, if you have a question, you can go to just to the page where you're listening on LinkedIn. And if you type in your comment on the event page, it will show up for us and we will see it and we will be able to answer it. But I will start with a question for you while we wait to see what folks would like to know more about. Have you published anything about generative AI for content marketers that is more readily available? Because I know, of course, a lot of Forrester content is gated or just for subscribers. But I'm wondering, is there anything that you've done recently that we can share with folks in the recap?
I appreciate you asking. Yeah, I publish regularly for Forrester clients. I am due to publish a blog. Our upcoming B2B Summit event, I will be talking about how our team's moving from exploration to excellence. I wanted to have a blog coming soon about what you can learn, first of all, from some early adopters. Usually, no surprise, there's somewhat of correlation with content maturity and or people who will admit, I've been around the curve and now I've learned this is how to do some of that. We all want to hear from others. But also, with that event season, I'm also going to be doing a webinar in the spring with one of my colleagues where we are coming out with a report on generative AI marketing adoption. And so it's also summarizing some of the things. If you are trying to talk a team through how do you really look organization-wide at stepping into adoption, we work with a lot of marketers where, again, it's very team by team or kind of fragmented, even in marketing, and how some people will adopt or use some technologies.
That's awesome. We'll definitely look for them. Or if you tag us with hashtag content chat when you publish, that way the folks that subscribe to the feed can find it that way too. And we can
Thanks
add
so
it.
much. Yeah, we'll do.
That's awesome. So Amy Higgins, she mentioned that she feels like tagging is so underrated and underutilized. And it can be, it can feel tedious, but it's, so helpful for personalization metrics. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, Lisa, on how to, how to get the most out of tagging, or anything, any kind of like good guidelines for folks on how to kind of get started if you haven't been very rigorous with tagging, which, we've all seen tagging lists with thousands of tags and duplicative tags that are not so helpful. So how do we avoid that and do something that actually helps us instead of just creating a big digital mess?
Yeah. Oh, I appreciate Amy's question, because tagging is, for a lot of us, it's just something to be done. You want to move on to the next stage and get your content out there. For a lot of marketers, it's kind of like, we'll do the minimum just to get our stuff uploaded and published. And we start to see, in general, humans are very subjective about it. And so it's really tough. In other words, you see some marketers who they're so enthusiastic, they use every tag imaginable. And that also pollutes results. So you have the under tagging, over tagging kind of extreme we were just talking about, of the minimalist to over tag. So I would say, if you were looking at this, this is a great time too in introducing. I know you don't want to do too much at once, but in using generative AI, if you are, along with your brand guidelines and voice and some of your greatest hits, talk about tagging practices, because I really would recommend, if you're thinking of a few principles, have people recognize you've got your defined asset types, content types, always use that. There are some signals to people when they do some searches on that. Also, if you are thinking about this from persona or audience, or are you thinking about it by stage? Do you have some definitions for people to understand what's your viewpoint about what stage or phase of the journey? Give people that as guidance. And then finally, if you're thinking about, a lot of times we use topic, or there are tags that have to do with our portfolio. And I would say, for a lot of people, if you're getting into some of that, yes, auto tagging is going to be helpful. It's also letting people know, for example, in the over tagging spirit, sometimes people tag every product possible or offering imaginable. Really be specific. What is the content about? Your tags should help with aboutness. You may be in a company where you've got some auto tagging capabilities. That's great. Or you may be using AI to help you with your metadata. But I look at that in terms of, be specific and trying to help people so they aren't over and under tagging. It's usually those four areas I was just talking about. If it's asset type, journey stage, persona, and then I'll call it topic / your offering. If you're giving people more guidance about that, and you're also probably stepping into having some tags about what is AI generated.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
And Amy noted that she has found a tagging roadmap
Yeah,
to be useful. And I think,
that's great.
that's definitely helpful if you don't have the
It
ability
is.
to have the tags built in, or have, only certain people can add new
Yes.
tags, and requiring that other folks in other roles can only use existing tags can sometimes be a way to stop the tag proliferation.
Yep.
And I think too, it can be helpful um, when you have like your submission forms or your templates
Yeah.
for content, if you actually have, you have the section for tags, but then you explain there, remind people there what the job is of the tag. So
Mhm.
if your CMS is helping people find related content by type or by
Yes.
topic or what have you, when you just put that actually in your submission form or your template, it makes people think about that. So then instead of giving you 15 tags, then I think it can help them kind of narrow things down a little bit.
That's a great example. I think that's the other thing, is most people aren't really sure, how is this going to help? And so it's either your enthusiasm, or we're just trying to get this done, just get it across the line. So that is really useful. And you're right. One other thing is to look at, if you have different tags in different systems, depending on your integrations, this might be another way to just do yourself a favor and start to harmonize, or get to some universal system that you're going to use. That way you don't have different tags in one place versus the other. It adds a lot more extra.
I did a very big project recently, putting together a big fat taxonomy sheet where we did
Yeah.
put in all of the different columns of here are all the different tags and all the different places. But what should they be? What should, our tags be that we all agree on? And it was really fun to be able to be that impartial third party that could come in and say, hey, here's what I recommend and why, because you get situations, especially in B2B, if they're doing lots of case studies, that everybody has their own perspective about how do you define an industry, for example.
Mhm.
And so some folks will be like, well, let's use, the government's classifications of business types. And other people will be like, well, in Salesforce, for example, we just put in whatever we want. We don't use those, but a set of classifications. So you can end up with, oh, this is a case study for manufacturing, and this is a case study for automotive finance. And you're like, wait a minute, sometimes you're way up here with the industry tag, and sometimes you're super granular. How is that helpful for your audience? So
Yes. Yeah, we do. We have all these, I'll call it traps, that for a lot of us looking at content, the different levels or hierarchies, then, like you said, whether it's industry or even your example of case study, when people across the organization are thinking, but wait, we have different formats or things you might call a case study.
and a lot of
Yes.
times they're use cases, for example, and not a
Yeah,
case study.
that's right. So yeah.
Well, we just had a question from Tomas
Mhm.
about what about using generative AI to
Oh,
research the
yeah.
target audience to learn what value props are most likely to resonate in content?
That's one where I hear a lot of people starting to think more about this of, can I test some ideas? Can I start by, and I will even do this at times, of really asking, if you're going back and forth about ideas or things that aren't as well known by that audience or by the persona, if you're doing some of that type of research, that is super helpful. And I'll just back up by saying, I know of some marketers, they have defined personas. There is someone who has done some research. Maybe it's a while back. Maybe they're doing some updates to it. Another thing in understanding your audience, that earlier comment about B2B would be, we know that maybe you're dealing with a buying group. Where do these audiences have shared interests? So if you're using, I know some marketers who have put in, let's say, even some interview information from their personas. Talk to me, ask the generative AI in your prompting style to really characterize where there are some shared interests and where there are unique nuances
Yeah.
and differences about that. That's a really wonderful way to, just for you, as you're using generative AI, you may be getting a lot more thoughtfulness about topic prompts or things that you might do in your content. If it comes back with some ideas for things that you might want to explain in some parts of your content, or again, if you think in your industry compared to your competitors, maybe you have something to say on a particular issue the audience cares about. I've also seen some marketers talk about they're getting ready for an event or a webinar, and they have a panel of some people who will be there.
Yeah.
Help me with this audience. What will the audience want to know as I'm planning some of the questions for the panel? You could play with some different experiment with some prompts on that.
Especially if you don't know all of the folks that are going to be on the panel that well, you may not be aware of some of like the content that they've previously created, or that they have a unique perspective on the topic, because of some kind of project they've done or place they've worked, etc.
Yeah.
So the AI, you point the AI at their LinkedIn profiles or at their blog, and you're going to get something that's going to be a lot more juicy and interesting, I
Yes.
think, than if you just try to, do a quick glance yourself, because the AI is just going to have all the context of, what makes each of those panel members different from each other. So that way you can tee up some questions where they will hopefully have some spirited and collegial debate, which is so much more interesting than everyone having the same answer and being
Yes.
like, oh yes, great answer, that's my answer too, because that's the world's most boring kind of panel when everyone agrees.
Yeah. And then, just building on that's fantastic because you get more out of your panel. And it's also, if you're looking at different members of your audience, what do they care about from panelist A versus panelist B? There are different ways you could do some experiments if you're using generative AI, not only thinking about your audience's needs or the questions that if you're asking about what have we not asked, or what do we not have covered in some of this?
And we just had a quick follow-up from Tomas around uncovering the unmet needs with AI. And then you test the validity of, all right, so AI said this is something that would be helpful. And sorry for the ginormous snore from Koopa back there. And then measuring which produced the greatest engagement. And I think, that goes back to your point earlier of, use the AI to to inform your content, but then make sure that you're going back and assessing, was this, did this perform better than your typical
Yep.
benchmark for this kind of content, for this kind of audience in this format? And of course, if you don't have those benchmarks in place, you need to have them in place before you start testing things with AI and saying, oh, this was a success or it wasn't, because otherwise, how are you measuring the success? You've probably been a judge for marketing awards programs, and I have too. And frequently you'll see a strategy that doesn't define any objectives. They're just like, we have these great results. It's like, but in what context are these great results? What were you trying to do? What would, this normally have looked like? You can't just be like, oh, the results were great, so the AI must be what was, fantastic here. You have to have that context.
Yes, I think that may be, if anything, if we get some change for marketers, if you are not involved firsthand in some of that, now you have grounds to talk to people about what do we think this will do, and putting that where in some roles content isn't as quantified. And I think that's where you really start the conversation. I knew one leader told me he was concerned about generative AI could almost become a playground. And so you're trying to talk to people about, use this for these results. How much is enough? That there is also a point of, just because you can, does it do anything for you? And so that's another good one too, of know your baseline. I love that advice, both in process and what you typically are seeing with your content before bringing in generative AI.
We only have a couple of minutes left here, so I wanted to ask you, Lisa, to share, where can folks find you to connect with you, to hear more from you? So, do you have a regular column for the Forrester blog? Give us your deets.
Thanks so much. I appreciate the opening. I blog at Forrester. You will find me. I am still on X. Lisa Gately is my handle. You've just given me a lot of inspiration. I have also been active with the Forrester What It Means podcast, and we are scheduled to come out with a podcast also this spring with some of the research on Gen AI adoption. So excellent. Yeah, I'm really excited from this. I'm glad to tag you all at future blogs and some of the future activities. Would love to keep in touch with you all.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for this lively conversation today. And I hope you've given folks, a sense of where to start in order to feel like you're getting some momentum going, but not feeling the overwhelm, because it can definitely feel like there's so many possibilities that it can feel, like being in the cereal aisle at the grocery store, where you're like, there are so many possibilities that I'm just going to get no cereal at all.
Yeah, you want to have a bit of focus. And yes, this is something very new. I think it gets a lot of fascination. But if we're getting around now this year to more practical side of this, what does this do to help us? AI is here to assist us, the human.
Exactly.
That is really the question of, are we able to now say, was it effective? Are we making choices about how we use it?
That's a perfect note for us to end on. So thank you again for being our guest, and we look forward to hearing your podcast and seeing your blog post. So until next time, everybody, have a great rest of your week.